Hi there, I am Pierre, and in this video I am presenting a Windows kernel vulnerability that we discovered and published in our paper Fast and Furious Outrunning Kernel Notification Routines from User Mode for DIMVA 2020. If this title isn't quite explicit to you, don't worry. I'm going to start by explaining what this is all about, and we will go through the background knowledge required as well. Okay, let's jump in.
In this presentation, we unveil a novel Windows kernel vulnerability allowing, for example, malware to steal credit card and banking information, pivoting between virtual machines and infecting virtual machines from the host, video game cheating, and disrupting anti-malware such as antiviruses. Let's now have a look at what this vulnerability is and how it functions, starting from the basics. So, one of the many roles of an operating system is to manage access control of the various resources such as files, registry keys, or processes. During this presentation, we're going to focus on process access control since the vulnerability presented allows to bypass process interaction protection. By default, a process can interact with another if it belongs to the same user or if it runs as administrator or system. This traditional security architecture is adequate for most situations. However, there are situations in which we may need protection from equally or even more privileged processes, including administrator or system processes, especially in security-critical software. Examples include point-of-sale software, since they have credit card information in memory while processing payments. A malicious process could retrieve this information with simple memory scanning. Many malware functioning this way have been observed in the wild. Banking applications for similar reasons. Virtualization software needs to protect its processes because if a process executing a virtual machine gets compromised, it would then be possible to access other virtual machines since they traditionally run under the same user. In addition to this, we also want to prevent access from more privileged processes since the host itself could be compromised. Video games, especially competitive online video games, also need to prevent access to that process, since getting access to them could be leveraged for cheating, which can have an immense impact on the reputation of a game, and consequently its sales. Several games and even entire game companies have been destroyed by their product earning the reputation of being riddled with hackers. And antiviruses and other anti-malware solutions often use a process running as the current logged-in user, which could be tampered with. Of course, good security practice would dictate that security-critical operations, such as scanning and intercepting malicious code, would be implemented either in a process running with high privileges or at kernel level, but getting access to the user process can allow for different level of disruption depending on the implementation. In our paper, we demonstrate how to bypass the protection of an antivirus, Symantec endpoint security, the virtualization software VirtualBox, and the two major video game anti-cheats, Easy Anti-Cheat and BattleEye. These real-world use cases are described in detail in our paper, along with the code of our exploit and a video demonstration of the exploit in action on a fully up-to-date Windows 10. Let's now have a look at how this security is implemented. Now that Windows protects against kernel modification, this security can only be implemented with a kernel module, also known as driver on Windows, using kernel notification routines and callbacks. The kernel notification routine allows the driver to be notified when a process is being spawned, and the callbacks allow to filter a requested handle to remove specific permissions. Let's have a look at this in practice. In this demonstration, I'm going to use two programs. The first program, named target, is really simple. It starts, prints out its own process ID into the console, and then pause execution. The second program, named getHandle, is also very simple. It asks the user for a target process ID and then calls open process to get a handle, and either prints out to the console the error or the return handle. If you are unfamiliar with what a handle is, it is really simple. It is simply an authorization ID that the system gives your program. It is just like your program asking the operating system, I would like the permission to interact with this process, and I would like to do these operations. For example, you could ask the permission to read memory, write memory, create threads, terminate the process, etc. In this case, we're asking for all permissions with process all access. Let's now have a look at that in action. I'm going to start the target process, which tells us that it has the process ID 1112. I start the process getHandle and give it the process ID of our target. It tells us that it obtained the handle with the ID CC, and I can use a program such as Process Hacker to visualize the permissions of this handle. we can see that the handle cc has full control over target.exe. Now I'm going to do the same experience with our protection driver running. So I'm starting our protection driver. So now this is an example driver that just removed the permission to terminate the process, but obviously you could remove the permission to read the memory, write the memory, create threads, etc. So let's do the same operation. Start the target with the process ID 2056. We obtain a handle on it. The handle obtained has the ID 48, and if we take a look at the permissions of this handle 48, we can see that we don't have full control. We only have this permission, that is full control minus terminate process, which indicates that the protection driver is working and filtering permissions. The discovered vulnerability bypasses this protection by getting a fully privileged handle before the protection is applied. Using different methods, we can obtain a fully privileged handle before the driver implements filtering. This is, in our opinion, caused by the sequence of operation happening when a process starts. When a process starts, it first initializes, then gets protection, and finally executes. This simple timeline alone allows us to see why this is problematic. Processes are unprotected during initialization, yet it is already possible to interact with them. Most notably, it is possible to use API functions taking a process ID as parameter, such as open process that we use to obtain a handle. When a process starts, the kernel performs a wide range of operations. It creates and fills the memory structures describing the new process, for example, K process and E process. It allocates pages of memory, creates threads, load modules, etc., before triggering notification routines and beginning execution. We believe that API functions taking a process ID as parameter become available as soon as the memory structures describing the process are created, which leave the process unprotected until it completes its initialization. This theory could be confirmed with extensive reverse engineering of the kernel, or by reviewing the kernel source code, if it was available, obviously. This means that to bypass this protection, one only needs to determine the process ID of the new process fast enough. We have developed two exploits that use different approaches to take advantage of this vulnerability. The first exploit gets notified of new processes being spawned using job objects, which are triggered during the initialization phase and before the kernel notification routines, which allow to outrun them. We found this exploitation technique by investigating how certain Windows system processes obtain a fully privileged handle on anti-cheat protected video games, notably CSRSS, LSASS, and the Program Compatibility Assistance Service PCA-SVC. We noticed that PCA-SVC was using a normal open process, and we thought it was either a system of whitelist allowing Windows system processes to evade the protection, or it was a timing issue. Using reverse engineering, we noticed that it used job objects to be notified of new processes, and by replicating this behavior, we could bypass the protection in a standalone exploit. We named this exploit hFrom job, since it gets a fully privileged handle using job objects. The second exploit instead tries to guess the process ID of the target. Using a set of threads, we attempt to get a fully privileged handle on every possible process ID as fast as possible, and we use a separate dedicated thread to analyze the gathered handles and find when we have successfully obtained our handle on the target. We named it hThemAll since we tried to get a fully privileged handle on every possible process ID. We also measured the time during which the vulnerability is present in CPU cycles and the equivalent in milliseconds. The details of those measurements can be found in our paper. Interestingly, the second exploit, hThemAll, makes the vulnerability last longer when using more threads, since it diverts resources that should be used to initialize the target process to the exploit. The full code of our exploits and protection driver, along with the details of real-world software exploited and a video demonstration, is included in our paper. Let's now have a look at the exploits in action, starting by our first exploit, hFrom job. I am starting the exploit. It is now being notified of new processes being created with job objects, and it will attempt to get a handle on target as soon as I start it. Target starts, and we can see here that our exploit has obtained the handle cc on target.exe. Let's have a look at the permissions of this handle. Handle cc on target, full control, despite the fact that the protection is active. Let's have a look at that. If we try now to obtain a handle with get handle, I input the process ID of targets, and we're given the handle D4. Let's have a look at the permissions of D4. We can see here that the permissions are being filtered because we don't have full control. We have full control minus process terminate that has been filtered by the driver, which means the protection is still active. Let's now have a look at our second exploit, hThemAll. I start the exploit. We now have 4 threads looking for our target process. I start the target process. Process ID 6504, and we're given the handle ID A0. Let's have a look at the permissions of this handle. We have full control on target.exe, and I'm going to show you that the protection is still active by trying to get a handle on 6504 normally. We have the handle 4c. Let's have a look at the permissions. 4c, and we can see that the permissions have been filtered. We don't have full control, and the driver is still protecting. Let's now see why this vulnerability is interesting. First off, this is not one of those flashy vulnerabilities that get given a catchy name and are all over the news because it is very niche and it's a local vulnerability, but it has a lot of potential for malware, for example. The APIs affected are security critical, and most worryingly, they are security critical in security software, as we've previously discussed. Second, Microsoft acknowledged the vulnerability and decided not to address it because they, quote, consider this scenario to be a defense in depth against third-party products, and also fixing this for in-market operating system would potentially result in significant application compatibility issues, unquote. This means that the vulnerability will most likely remain for a long time even after public disclosure. Third, there is no easy fix for third-party developers. After disclosing the vulnerability to anti-cheat companies, they implemented a fix by terminating the protected process right at spawn and restarting it from kernel space, probably to obtain the process ID in time, possibly with an API such as zwcreateProcess. This solution may not be suitable for all situations, and it seems to be using undocumented functions and memory structures. Lastly, even if Microsoft was willing to patch the kernel, it might be hard to solve because Windows seems to need this flaw to function. This is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting findings. Let me explain why. If you read what OB register callback does, you might think that you could implement this security just using callbacks, entirely without kernel notification routines, since it allows you to filter handles on the target process. And indeed, if you create a protection driver using OB register callback to filter all handles, it does work. But it works so well that it actually prevents Windows system processes from obtaining their handle on the protected process, and this prevents it from running entirely. It is unfortunately not possible to implement a whitelist of processes allowed to evade the protection because the callback function in the driver is not passed information about the process requesting the handle, only the target. Therefore, it seems that developers have been unknowingly finding their way around the issue by using kernel notification routines, which is where the problem resides, and the system requires this insecure time period during initialization for the system processes to get their handle. There are 2 key takeaways from this discovery. First, initialisation is often an overlooked potential weakest link. This is not only valid for operating system security, but in pretty much all contexts. For example, not so long ago, there were new attacks discovered on the WPA2 Wi-Fi security that targeted the initialization phase as well. And second, these exploitation methods may be used for further vulnerability research. We have only experimented with process notification routines, but there are other routines that may be vulnerable, for example, thread and load image notify routines. This concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening.